It is 2 o'clock in the morning on the 27th of April, 1865, and the Mississippi is not itself. The spring melt has come down hard. The river has climbed its banks and spread into the bottomlands, so that in places the water runs 3 miles wide, cold and brown and moving fast, with the tops of drowned trees breaking the surface where a field used to be. Against that current, a sidewheel steamboat is working her way upstream. Her name is the Sultana. She is 7 miles above Memphis, her cabin lights burning, most of her passengers asleep on every deck and stairway and patch of open floor. There are more than 2,000 of them aboard a boat built to carry a few hundred. And then, in the dark, 3 of her 4 boilers let go at once. The sound reaches Memphis. The sky over the river turns orange. By the time the last man is pulled from the water, somewhere between 1,100 and 1,800 people will be dead, more than would die on the Titanic, more than on any American ship before or since. It is the worst maritime disaster in the history of the United States, and almost no one remembers it. The question is a simple one, and its answer is not. How does a boat certified for 376 people come to be carrying more than 2,000, and why did no one stop it? The Sultana was a good boat, not an old one. Built at Cincinnati in 1863, a wooden sidewheeler about 260 feet long, she ran the lower Mississippi, carrying cotton, sugar, and passengers between St. Louis and New Orleans. 2 years of service. Nothing about her was cursed, everything about her was ordinary. Like every American passenger steamer of her day, the Sultana carried an enrollment certificate that fixed by law the number of persons she was permitted to carry. Federal steamboat law of the period set that figure by the vessel's tonnage and accommodation, and the Sultana's certificate allowed 376 people, crew included. The rule was plain, and it was printed on a document any inspector could read. What happened in April of 1865 was that the document ceased to matter. Her master was Captain James Cass Mason, a riverman with a reputation and a problem. The problem was money. Mason had a share in the boat and debts against that share, and a business that lived voyage to voyage. An empty deck was a loss he could not easily absorb. So when the war ended and a particular kind of cargo appeared on the Vicksburg levee, Mason listened. That cargo was men, Union prisoners of war newly released from the Confederate camps as the fighting stopped, gathering by the thousands to be shipped north and home. The government paid the steamboat lines by the head to carry them, $5 for an enlisted man and $10 for an officer. A full load of prisoners was the best fare on the river. The Army's own rules governed how such men were to be moved. Regulations for troop transport fixed how many soldiers a vessel of a given size could carry, and required that the men be distributed across the available boats, rather than crowded onto one. The number of steamers waiting at Vicksburg meant the released prisoners could have been spread comfortably among them. That was the standard. The Sultana was about to break it many times over, and the officer in charge of putting those men onto boats at Vicksburg was the chief quartermaster, Captain Reuben Hatch. Hatch had a history of accusations behind him and an offer in front of him. He could steer the whole load onto one boat, Mason's boat, in exchange for a share of the money, a kickback. Mason agreed. To understand who these passengers were, you have to understand where they had just come from. Most of them were survivors of 2 of the worst prison camps of the war. Some came from Cahaba in Alabama, an old cotton warehouse on the riverbank the prisoners called Castle Morgan, so crowded that men slept in shifts. Most came from Andersonville in Georgia, a stockade of pine logs enclosing a few open acres, with a single foul creek for water and a line of stakes inside the wall the guards called the dead line. Cross it, and you were shot. Of the roughly 45,000 men held at Andersonville, nearly 13,000 died there of dysentery and scurvy, of starvation and exposure. The men who lived through it and were walking to the boats at Vicksburg were, many of them, skeletal. Some weighed under 100 pounds. Some could not stand without help. These were the men going home. They had endured the war and endured the camps, and the last thing between them and their families was a boat ride up the river. They boarded gladly. Every account agrees on that. They packed themselves onto the Sultana, singing and joking, 3 deep on the stairs, because the alternative was waiting another day, and they had waited long enough. Now the 2 failures, the money and the machine, meet in 1 week at Vicksburg. Days before she took on the prisoners, the Sultana had sprung a leak in one of her 4 boilers. These were tube boilers, long iron cylinders, and a seam between 2 of them had bulged and begun to weep. Mason had a boilermaker come down to look at her. Here, the rules of the era were explicit. Federal steamboat law required that every boiler be inspected and certified before a passenger vessel could operate, that boilerplate meet a standard of quality, and that a boiler carry a certified maximum working pressure the engineer was forbidden to exceed. A bulged, leaking seam was exactly the kind of defect the inspection regime existed to catch, and the proper repair was defined by the trade. The boilermaker's judgment was clear. The bulged plate should be cut out and replaced, the seam rebuilt to the strength of the plate around it. That was the safe repair, and it would take 2 or 3 days. 2 or 3 days was exactly what Mason could not spend. If the Sultana sat at the levee that long, the load of prisoners, his load, the profitable one, would be put onto the next boat instead, so the safe repair was set aside. The ship's engineer had the bulged plate hammered back roughly into shape and a patch riveted over the seam, a patch of thinner iron than the boiler around it. It was done in a single day. The boilermaker signed off on it only on the understanding that a proper repair would follow later in St. Louis. A patch of understrength iron over a certified seam was, by the standard of the trade, no repair at all. There would be no later. Meanwhile, the loading went on, and it went past all reason. There were 3 steamboats at Vicksburg that could have shared the prisoners, the arrangement the transport rules called for. 2 of them left that week, nearly empty. The clerks at the parole camp lost track of their own count. There was confusion over the books and suspicion that other captains were being bribed too, and in the muddle the order came down to simply put every remaining man onto the Sultana. The officer who actually loaded the men, Captain George Williams, was a West Point graduate and a careful soldier, no party to any bribe. He had been told the parole camp had to be emptied that day, and he believed the count was far lower than it was. So a competent officer, acting on bad numbers and pressure from above, kept sending men up the gangplank while the true total climbed out of anyone's sight. What did the disaster was a chain of ordinary decisions, each defensible on its own, ending somewhere no one intended. Officers who saw the deck filling up and objected were overruled. The count climbed past 1,000, past 1,500, past 2,000, on a boat legally allowed 376. She was so heavy, the decks visibly sagged. Carpenters had to prop them up with beams before she could sail. She left Vicksburg overloaded and fighting a flood. Here the design flaw and the patch and the water conspire. A steamboat rolls slightly as it works a curving river. When the Sultana leaned one way, water inside the boilers would run to the low side, leaving the metal on the high side dry and glowing over the fire. When she leaned back, the cold water rushed onto that superheated iron and flashed into steam all at once, a hard spike of pressure, again and again, against a boiler already patched thin. She fought that flooded current all day and into the night. Somewhere north of Memphis, at about 2 in the morning, the pressure found the weak seam. 3 of the 4 boilers exploded together. The blast tore upward through the center of the boat, through the decks where the men lay sleeping, and threw hundreds of them into the river. The smokestacks came down. The superstructure caught fire almost at once, and the flames drove the survivors toward the stern and then into the water, into a flooded river running cold and 3 miles wide in the dark, with no near bank to reach. Many of the men could not swim. Many were too weak to. Men who had lived through Andersonville, who had counted the days to this exact night, drowned within sight of the lights of Memphis. Then the city woke. Memphis came out onto the water. The crews of steamboats tied up at the levee cast off in the dark and went upriver toward the fire. The gunboat Essex and the steamer Tyler and others put out boats. Civilians rowed skiffs into the current, pulling men off floating wreckage and off drowned treetops, off the roofs of half-submerged houses in the flooded bottoms. And among the people of Memphis who went out that night were former Confederate soldiers, men who, weeks earlier, had been the enemy of nearly every man in the water. That detail is carried down in the survivors' own accounts. The war was over. In the river, there was only the drowning and the ones who could reach them. They saved perhaps 800 people. Many of those died later of burns and of the exposure of a cold night in the water. The dead were carried downriver for weeks, and some were never found at all. That is one reason the toll has never been fixed to a single number. The accounting is where the record thins to almost nothing. The government held inquiries. They laid out the overloading, the bribery, the patched boiler, and then almost nothing followed from any of it. Reuben Hatch, the quartermaster at the center of the kickback, was never brought to trial. He was allowed to resign, and he died a few years later. Captain Mason had gone down with his boat and could not be tried. In the end, the machinery of justice settled on one man, Captain Frederick Speed, a Union officer at the parole camp who was court-martialed for overcrowding the Sultana and found guilty. But Speed had spent that day at the camp and had not personally put a single man aboard the boat. On review, the Judge Advocate General overturned the conviction. Speed's record was cleared. So the tally is this: more than 1,100 dead, by some counts nearer 1,800, and no one punished. Not the quartermaster, not the captain, not the clerks who lost the count, not the men who overruled it. One conviction, and it was reversed, and the country barely noticed. Lincoln had been shot 12 days before. The newspapers were full of the funeral train moving north, and on the very day before the Sultana burned, the killing of John Wilkes Booth in a Virginia barn. A disaster on the river, far to the west, with a passenger list of poor released prisoners, could not compete for the front page. The Sultana slipped out of the nation's memory almost as she happened. What the disaster could not win in justice, it slowly won in engineering. The tube boilers of the Sultana's type were bad performers, prone to exactly the hotspot failure that destroyed her, and after 2 more steamboats with similar boilers exploded in the months that followed, that design was abandoned on the lower Mississippi. More lastingly, the era of boiler explosions, and there were many, for steamboat boilers had been killing Americans for decades, pushed the country toward the idea that a pressure vessel is a public danger rather than a private matter. Out of that pressure came stricter federal inspection of steamboat boilers and independent inspection companies founded to certify them. The principle that a boiler must be examined by someone with no stake in the voyage is, in part, a lesson paid for on the Mississippi that April night. Steamboat boilers had been bursting on American rivers for a generation before the Sultana. In the 1830s and 40s alone, exploding boilers had killed thousands of passengers, and Congress had already passed steamboat safety acts that were widely ignored or under-enforced. The Sultana was the largest example of a danger the country had been tolerating for decades because the boats were profitable and the inspections were thin. The certification existed, and so did the capacity limit, the working pressure ceiling, and the repair standard. On one April night, all of them were treated as paperwork, and the safe repair the boilermaker asked for, the one that would have taken 3 days, was the cheapest to ignore. The men who lived did not forget, even if the country did. They formed survivors' associations, one in the north around Ohio and Indiana and Michigan, one in the south around Tennessee and Kentucky, and they met every year on the anniversary to read the roll and remember the ones who did not come back. They met into the 1920s, then into the 1930s, as their number thinned to a handful of old men. The last of them, a Tennessee cavalryman named Charles Eldridge, lived until 1941, 76 years after the night in the river. Today, near Marion, Arkansas, close to where the flood carried the dead, there is a plain marker. It reads, "The Loss of the Sultana." It records that the overcrowded steamboat exploded on the Mississippi, that most aboard were Federal soldiers just freed from Confederate prisons, that roughly 1,500 perished, and that this remains the worst disaster in American nautical history. They were men who survived Andersonville and Cahaba, who had endured everything the war could do to them, and who died in the river because it was cheaper to patch a boiler than to fix it. That is the last known position of the Sultana, 7 miles above Memphis, 2 o'clock in the morning, the 27th of April, 1865.